Now in our 23rd year of service to the worldwide amateur radio community, we are This Week in Amateur Radio, your all-amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. This is edition number 1232, with a release and air date of Saturday, October 8th, 2022. Please take the program to your air following the Q-tone. Welcome in to another spin around the atmosphere as we look at all the latest news and happenings in the world of amateur radio and the wider world of communications. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Now we're approaching our 24th year of service to the radio hobbyists all around the world. Here are all the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1232 of This Week in Amateur Radio. The Amateur Radio Digital Communications Foundation gives a grant to the Internet Archive to develop a new project called the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications. We will have all the details for you. Amateur radio remains active during the past 2 weeks of hurricanes in the south. The ARRL Foundation Club Grant Program application period is now open until November 4th. Proposals are being sought for upcoming amateur radio contacts with the crew of the International Space Station for 2023. The FCC approves changes to improve the sound quality and details of broadcast emergency alert system notifications. The Radio Society of Great Britain will play host for the upcoming transatlantic centenary tests. The Scouting Jamboree on the Air is coming up soon. We will tell you all about that. 2 more amateurs are scheduled to arrive at the ISS aboard the maiden flight of NASA's new Starliner 1 spacecraft. The Geritol Net returns to the ham bands, and we will have a look at those TV detector vans that drive around the UK looking for active television screens that are not paying their receiver licensing fee. All this and a lot more are straight ahead in this week's report. These headline stories will come to you in a moment along with this week's special features. We will have a talk given for new hams by Don Keith, K4KC, given at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, entitled N4KC's Top 5 Get on the Air Quick Antennas. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT on what's new with all of those amateur satellites in orbit. Our technology reporter, Leo Laporte, W6TWT, will tell us about Huawei Technologies in China, who has proposed a new form of the Internet that is more controllable. And he will tell you about installing a free operating system on an old computer that you are planning to donate. Australia's own Onno Benshoff, VK6FLAB, will talk about the amateur's code for future generations. Our own amateur radio historian, Bill Continelli, W2XOI, returns with another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives. This week, Bill takes us back to Monday, April 12, 1912, and the Titanic disaster, and highlights how this event changed the fledgling amateur radio hobby. And our tower climbing and antenna master, Greg Stoddard, KF9MP, will tell us all you need to know about climbing at night. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio here in beautiful downtown and very colorful now that it's fall, Albany, New York, I'm George, W2XBS.
And reporting from the newsroom in Half Moon, New York, I'm Terry Saunders, N1KIN.
And reporting this week from the Ham Shack of K2MST in the Museum of Science and Technology in Syracuse, New York, I'm Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
And reporting from our news bureau in Rochester, New York, along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, I'm Dave Wilson, WA2HOY.
And reporting from the gold and red and orange and green Western Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, where the beautiful fall colors continue for one more weekend, I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And reporting from our Troy, New York News Bureau, where we're at about 40% foliage change, I'm Eric, KD2RJX.
And reporting from our news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where the annual summer-autumn battle continues unabated, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
And now with this week's lead story, here is Terry Saunders, N1KIN.
Thanks to funding from Amateur Radio Digital Communications Foundation, the Internet Archive is building an online digital library of amateur radio and communications, and they're asking amateurs for material. With more information on this ambitious project, we go to Steve Richards, G4HPE, who files this story through the facilities of the Southgate News Service.
The Internet Archivist blog said that they want the obscure stuff, the locally produced ham radio newsletters, or the smaller magazines. The team has begun gathering content for the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, which will be a massive online repository of materials and collections related to amateur radio and early digital communications. The DLARC is funded by a significant grant from the Amateur Radio Digital Communications Foundation to create a digital library that documents, preserves, and provides open access to the history of this community. This innovative project aims to digitize print materials such as newsletters, journals, books, pamphlets, equipment specifications, and other records from both institutions, groups, and individuals. They will also undertake a digital archiving program to store, curate, and provide access to what they describe as born digital materials, such as digital photographs, websites, videos, and podcasts. There will be a personal archiving campaign to ensure the preservation and future access of both print and digital archives of notable individuals and stakeholders in the amateur radio community. The archivists will conduct oral history interviews with key members of the community, and they are dedicated to the preservation of all physical and print collections donated to the Internet Archive. The goals of the online digital library are to document the history of amateur radio and to provide freely available educational resources for researchers, students, and the general public. The project is looking for partners and contributors with troves of ham radio, amateur radio, and early digital communications-related books, magazines, documents, catalogues, manuals, videos, software, personal archives, and other historical record collections, no matter how big or small. In addition to physical material to digitize, they're looking for podcasts, newsletters, video channels, and other digital content that can enrich the DLARC collections. Internet Archive will work directly with groups, publishers, clubs, individuals, and others to ensure the archiving and perpetual access of contributed collections, their physical preservation, their digitization, and their online availability and promotional use for research, education, and historical documentation. All the collections in this digital library will be universally accessible to any user, and there will be a customized access and discovery portal with special features for research and educational purposes. You can find out more at gizmodo.com. That's gizmodo.com.
In their release, they said that they're extremely grateful to ARDC for funding this project and are very excited to work with this community to explore a multi-format digital library that documents and ensures access to the history of a specific, noteworthy community. Anyone with material to contribute to the DLARC library, questions about the project, or interest in similar digital library building projects for other professional communities, please contact Kay Savitz, K6KJN, Program Manager, Special Collections, via email to k@archive.org. That's Kilo Alpha Yankee @archive.org. We are proud to reveal that This Week in Amateur Radio has been part of the Internet Archive since our inception some 23 years ago, and look forward to being one of the first in the amateur radio community to be part of the new DLARC archive collection. We hope to keep in touch with the folks at the Internet Archive for periodic reports on the development of the new Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications.
You are listening to North America's premier news and information service for the amateur radio hobbyist. We are This Week in Amateur Radio.
The VOIP Hurricane Net, the Hurricane Watch Net, and the amateur radio station at the National Hurricane Center, WX4NHC, contributed hundreds of hours of tracking and taking reports for Hurricanes Fiona and Ian. With more details on amateur radio's contribution during the storms and its continued support during recovery efforts, we go to John Ross, KD8 IDJ, who files this report from League headquarters.
Amateur radio operators from Puerto Rico, Florida, and the U.S. East Coast worked for almost 2 weeks, making sure damage reports and requests for assistance were dispatched in a timely manner. HWN manager Bobby Graves, KB5HAV, reported that their activation for Hurricane Fiona lasted 39.5 hours. There were 109.5 hours of on-air manpower and 246.5 hours total man-hours. The HWN was activated 4 times for Fiona, twice on its approach to Puerto Rico and twice on its landfall, said Graves. We collected and forwarded 23 service reports to the National Hurricane Center in Miami by way of WX4NHC. For Hurricane Ian, HWN Assistant Manager Stan Broadway, N8BHL, added, our activation for Ian lasted for nearly 5 full days with a total of 83 hours. There were a total of 383.5 hours of on-air manpower and 1,014.5 total man-hours. We collected and forwarded 164 surface reports to the National Hurricane Center. The VOIP Hurricane Net reported that over the entire course of Ian, from its tropical storm force effects in Grand Cayman, major landfall in Cuba and southwest Florida, and landfall in South Carolina and North Carolina, they sent approximately 150 reports. An approximate volunteer man-hour content for this hurricane is estimated to be over 150 hours, including the planning, execution, and release of activation information, also accounting for those stations in the affected areas or stations that were relays into the affected area of reporting storm damage, said Graves. I'm John Ross, KD8 IDJ.
ARRL Director of Emergency Management Josh Johnson, KE5MHV, had previously reported that many ARRL amateur radio emergency services volunteers and their groups were involved across Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Johnston said that there were ARES members at the request of the Florida Division of Emergency Management serving in the State Emergency Operations Center. Many ARES groups were also operating in several shelter locations. The National Hurricane Center continues to monitor activity in the North Atlantic, Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico.
The ARRL Foundation Club Grant Program opened a second grant proposal period, which began September 7, 2022, and runs until November 4, 2022, at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Radio clubs can apply now, and information about the program can be found on the ARRL website at www.arrl.org/club-grant-program. Following the first proposal period that ran earlier this year, 128 clubs applied for grants with a variety of outstanding projects. Emphasis is placed on projects that have a component of community involvement, training, new ham development, and club revitalization. 24 clubs were chosen, and nearly $270,000 was awarded. Clubs that applied in the first round and did not receive a grant are urged to reapply. The ARRL Foundation will award an additional $230,000 in grants at the end of the second application round. An informational webinar was held on September 7th, and a recording of that event can be seen on ARRL's YouTube channel.
Amateur radio on the International Space Station is seeking formal and informal education institutions and organizations, individually or working together, to host an amateur radio contact with a crew member on board the International Space Station in 2023. Organizations that want to participate will need to submit a proposal no later than November 13th of 2022. ARISS is looking for proposals that will draw large numbers of participants and integrate into a well-developed education plan. To assist with the proposals, ARISS has posted information about expectations and guidelines on their website. In addition, an ARISS proposal webinar session will be held October 13th of 2022 at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. ARRS anticipates holding the contact between July 1st and December 31st of 2023. Crew scheduling and ISS orbits will determine the exact radio contact dates. Crew members aboard the ISS will participate in scheduled amateur radio contacts approximately 10 minutes in length, and they'll allow students to interact with the astronauts through a question-and-answer session. An ARRS ISS contact is a voice-only communications opportunity via amateur radio. It takes place between astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the space station and classrooms and communities. ARRS contacts afford educational audiences an opportunity to learn firsthand what it's like to live and work in space. Such contacts provide the chance to learn about space research conducted on the ISS. Students will also have an opportunity to learn about satellite radio communication, wireless technology, and radio science. Amateur radio organizations around the world, with the support of NASA and space agencies in Canada, Japan, Europe, and Russia, present educational organizations with this opportunity. The ham radio organization's volunteer efforts provide much of the equipment and operational support that enables communication between the ISS crew and students around the world. ARRS is a cooperative venture of the International Amateur Radio Societies and the space agencies that support the ISS. In the U.S., sponsors are Radio Amateur Satellite Corporation, ARRL, the ISS National Space Laboratory Station Explorers, Amateur Radio Digital Communications, and NASA's Space Communications and Navigation Programs. The primary goal of ARRS is to promote exploration of science, technology, and engineering, the arts, and mathematics topics. For more information about ARRS, visit their website at www.arriss.org.
The Federal Communications Commission on Thursday voted unanimously to approve several updates to the emergency alert system. The primary focus of the proceeding was to help ensure the deaf and hard of hearing community is able to get adequate information during a disaster. That includes making sure the text crawl matches the recorded message aired on local television stations. But as part of the FCC's ongoing effort to modernize EAS, there are several changes that will also affect radio stations. Under the new rules, even when an alert is sent through the legacy broadcast-based EAS system, radio stations will need to check for a companion alert on the Internet-based Common Alerting Protocol system. If there was one, stations would need to use that version. This is valuable because this version provides more details, like how those who receive it should respond to the emergency, said Rosenworcel. The FCC order also says that when radio stations air the CAP-delivered file, it often provides audio that is superior in clarity and quality than relaying the broadcast-based legacy system, which, depending on local weather conditions, can sound especially bad. The Commission acknowledges requiring stations to hold off on sending the alert to check for a CAP version will delay getting messages out to the public, but it hopes to limit the gap. The new rules only require stations to wait at a minimum of 10 seconds to see if a duplicate CAP version is available before transmitting the legacy alert. The Commission also approved the proposal that will change the nationwide Emergency Alert System Test Event Code from jargonistic National Periodic Test to Nationwide Test of the Emergency Alert System. It also changes the PEP Originator Code from Primary Entry Code System to United States Government. The revisions mean that the new header text would read, "The United States Government has issued a nationwide test of the Emergency Alert System." In the order PS docket number 15-94, the Commission says the changes would result in simpler and more straightforward terminology that is less likely to confuse EAS participants or the public. The FCC also believes a more specific description of the national test will make it clearer to the public that the alerts are only tests while minimizing alerting fatigue. Commissioner Jeffrey Starks called the change common sense at a time when it seems that such events are affecting every corner of the country. Millions of Americans will benefit from clearer and more detailed information during emergencies, he said. But it is what the Commission ultimately opted not to do that is likely to bring a sigh of relief from many broadcasters. It has rejected the proposal that would have allowed EAS alerts to continuously play until the alert time has expired or is canceled by the originator. The FCC says it received virtually unanimous opposition, including from broadcasters, alert senders, and equipment makers. But it is something more basic that could have sidelined the idea. The Commission says it is not convinced that putting legacy EAS alerts on repeat would be technically feasible. It is also troubled that the message could quickly become outdated if conditions change, while likely blocking out any emergency news programming that might provide updated information. The Commission also decided not to create a new regional test code or require stations to update their hardware. The order said that such a mandate would yield only minimal benefits because most of the updates are directed towards creating a more detailed visual display of the message. Although a few radio broadcasters might be able to display the new prescribed script on digital radio receiver screens, the order says imposing that requirement on the large majority of radio broadcasters would have no impact on alert clarity.
You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at www.twiar.net.
The Street Key Sentry Club is asking its members to call upon a skill that requires a good hand and a good eye instead of a good fist and a good ear. The club is preparing for activities marking the 17th anniversary of its founding, and that means it needs a new and unique QSL card for a special event. Every year, the Straight Key Sentry Club designates January as Straight Key Month, and starting on January 2nd, operators get on the air using the special event call sign K3Y. Members have until December 14th to submit their designs, and then the club gets to vote on the submissions, which are displayed on the event webpage. The design with the most votes becomes the design of the official K3Y QSL card, and many of the others become part of the Straight Key Sentry Club print calendar for 2023. No, it's not too early to start thinking about 2023 or this special event. If you're a club member who likes to design QSL cards, or if you want to try, this is your chance. Designers are permitted to submit their cards from previous competitions in the hopes of making it to the top this year.
The Daily Heller column by Stephen Heller, Kilo Charlie 1 Charlie Kilo Romeo, in Print magazine, features amateur radio QSL card design. Stephen comments that for the real transmitting fanatics, CB radio was never the ultimate thrill. Ham or amateur radio was the ultimate means to reach out and touch somebody, not just a mile or two away, but given the proper weather conditions, hundreds, even thousands of miles from one's personal radio shack, which in Steve's case was a corner of his bedroom. Whether CB or ham, one of the prizes was making contact and sharing location information. In return, the operators mailed out and collected QSL cards. Strictly, QSL means either the question, "Do you confirm receipt of my transmission?" or the statement, "I confirm receipt of your transmission." It can also mean, "Please send me a QSL card." These are usually about the same size as a postcard, often elaborately decorated to express individuality. QSL cards routinely show a call sign or listener number, a place of origin, the time, date and frequency of the contact, and reception quality reports. Some cards have illustrative elements, others are just basic wording. They're still used, but often sent digitally these days. Although the sending of QSL cards via Postal Bureau is still practiced, the Internet has pretty much taken over. The organisation Standards Manual is an independent publishing imprint founded by designers Jesse Reed and Hamish Smythe in New York City in 2014. Their mission is to archive and preserve artefacts of design history and make them available to future generations. From reprinted graphics standards manuals to new compendiums of archival work, their titles always aim to make great design available to all. When they researched it, the graphics associated with QSL cards were a revelation to Standards Manual, and they've just released their latest book, QSL, Do You Confirm Receipt of My Transmission? It's a collection of over 150 QSL card designs, showcasing the often overlooked visual history of amateur radio. When they saw an archive from the collection of QSL card designer Roger Bova, who also specialises in identity and branding design, the Standards Manual team were amazed by the graphics. Jesse Reed said that the cards reveal a rich typographic expression that is rare in their authenticity, each card a personal reflection of the station's operator. You can read Stephen's full editorial column at www.printmag.com. Search for the Art and Design of Ham Radio item.
According to NASA, 2 amateur radio operators were recently chosen to return to the International Space Station, but this time they expect to arrive there aboard the first flight of NASA's new Boeing Starliner 1. Astronaut Scott Tingle, KG-5NZA, will be its commander, and Mike Fink, KE-5AIT of NASA, will serve as the Starliner's pilot. They will join Jeanette Epps, KF-5QNU, who will be aboard as mission specialist. NASA signed her in August 2020 to join the crew. There is no launch date yet for Starliner 1. It must complete NASA's Boeing crew flight test, which ensures the spacecraft can fly crewed missions to the ISS on a regular basis. This is part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. The first test flight is scheduled for early 2023.
The International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, has announced the election of Doreen Bogdan-Martin of the United States of America as the next ITU Secretary General. Bogdan-Martin will assume office on January 1, 2023. She is radio amateur call sign KD2JTX. The election took place during ITU's Plenipotentiary Conference in Bucharest, Romania, on Thursday, September 29, 2022. Bogdan-Martin won the position with 139 votes out of 172 votes cast by representatives of member states. The ITU press release on the election read, "This is an exciting development for the ITU," said International Amateur Radio Union President Tim Elam, VE6SH. She will be the first female Secretary General and only the third to hold an amateur license. Doreen has an exciting agenda for International Telecommunications Union. The U.S. Department of State website lists her deep involvement with the ITU, most recently as director of the ITU's Telecommunication Development Bureau. The website listed her accomplishments in bringing about upgrades that better embrace digital advances, and that her work in the role supported global efforts to promote school connectivity and greater involvement of youth. Under her leadership, the ITU focused on giving youth more of a voice in strategy and programs. She posted on her Twitter account on September 19th, "I'm immensely proud to be the first woman ever elected to the post of ITU Secretary General. We've finally smashed a 157-year-old glass ceiling, and I hope this result inspires women and girls everywhere to dream big and make those dreams a reality." Her rival for the post was Rashid Ismailov of Russia, who lost in a vote of 139 votes to 25. She will make an outstanding ITU Secretary General and one IARU will be proud to work with on behalf of the amateur services, said Elam.
Congratulations to Swedish tech entrepreneur Peter Lothberg, SM4KEL/W4KEL, whose work in helping in the internet get an early foothold and grow in Sweden has won him a gold medal from the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. King Gustaf is to present the medal to him next month. Dubbed an internet guru by Wired.com in 2007, he has given much sought-after advice to industry giants such as Cisco and Sprint. With this gold medal, Peter joins the ranks of scores of similarly decorated Academy innovators. The Academy, also known as the IVA, says on its website that its vision is technology in the service of humanity, in the belief that technical and economic science can make a positive contribution to society.
ARRL Electromagnetic Compatibility Committee member Gerald J. Ramie, KI6LGY, has received the Lawrence G. Cummings Award for Outstanding Service on August 4th of 2022. John Ross, KD8IDJ, has more on this report from ARRL headquarters in Newington.
Presented by the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, EMC Society, the award recognized Ramie for promoting meaningful EMC immunity testing for utility control products over the last decade. Ramie's work began in 2010 with the National Institute of Standards and Technology Smart Grid Interoperational Panel. He worked for 10 years to get 8 missing immunity tests included in the IEEE Power and Energy Society list of EMC immunity standards for substation communications equipment. ARRL deserves the Cumming Award as much as I do, said Ramie. None of this standards work could have been done without that support, and it will save lives. It has certainly been life-changing for me. ARRL Laboratory Manager Ed Hare, W1RFI, said Ramie's work ensured that the modern power grid would be immune to the transmissions of nearby transmitters. This protects the grid against threats from radio transmissions of any kind, said Hare. This work demonstrates the value of amateur radio and its continuing contributions to the development of new technology. Hare also said that if amateur radio transmitters were to cause the grid not to function, the value of amateur radio communication would be diminished, and in many cases, amateurs could be held to blame for that interference. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
Ramie was granted his general class license in 2017 at the suggestion of Hare. He asked if he could work together on more amateur radio issues and suggested that I should acquire a license to make that easier, said Ramie. I studied materials that Hare sent me and went on for a course and 2 days of testing in Fremont, California. Ramie went on to say that he continues to log into UHF networks sometimes and to have several good friends on local ham clubs.
You're listening to America's premier amateur radio news magazine of the air. This Week in Amateur Radio.
And now with the latest technology news and commentary from Petaluma, California. This Week in Amateur Radio is proud to present Leo Laporte.
Let's talk tech, you and me. We're having a fun time. This is like a little user group here. Let's see what's been going on in the world around us. As if you didn't know. For instance, I think it's really interesting that a lot of different organizations are using the emergency of the virus to kind of leap on other bandwagons, hoping no one will notice. For instance, China and Huawei proposing something they call new IP, a new internet. The proposal has caused concerns, according to the Financial Times, among Western countries, including the UK, Sweden, and the US, who think that the proposal that China and Huawei made at the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, would splinter the global internet. We have a system right now, you're probably familiar with it, TCP, IP, the IP addresses you've heard about over and over again, because mysterious dotted quads, the 4 numbers separated by periods, and the whole system of DNS, all that stuff that we talk about, the complicated stuff. That was invented many, many years ago by a guy named Vince Cerf and a group of scientists at the Department of Defense, at DARPA, at private industry, companies like Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, universities like Stanford and MIT, all collaborated to create this thing we use today, 30, 40 years later, we know as the internet. It works pretty darn well, if you ask me. It's working real well right now, isn't it? Admittedly, there's some burden on it. People are watching a lot more Netflix, so there's a little burden on it. But what would we do? How would we work from home without it? How would we, now you can Netflix and chill. You can't go to the movie theater, but you can Netflix and chill. That's not so bad. It would be hard to imagine doing what we're doing these days without the internet. But China thinks it's not good enough. And it's interesting because one of the points of new IP is to give, according to the U.S., the state-run internet service providers granular control over how its citizens use the internet. Oh, China, that's what you want? What a surprise. It has gained the support of Russia. No surprise there either. And Saudi Arabia. What do these three authoritarian regimes have in common? Well, the internet's a threat to them. One of the features Huawei, the Chinese company Huawei, has built into new IP, something described as a shut up command. A shut up command. That means a central point in the network could cut off communication to or from a particular address. So basically, the internet, the way it works now, in theory, and admittedly, this is what we fight for all the time when we're talking about net neutrality, is an agnostic postman that simply moves the data, the boxes, the packets around. Doesn't inquire as to what the packet contains or who it's being sent from or to. That's none of its business. Just like in the postal service or the telephone companies. None of my business. And that's how it should be. That's what net neutrality is all about. Packets is packets. No packets are greater than other packets. This system, and you can, as with all of these kind of power grabs, you can always slice it differently to make it sound palatable. Well, how are we supposed to turn off malware command and control servers? How are we supposed to shut up terrorists? We need a command like this so we can shut down the bad actors on the internet, and there are plenty. Problem is, the bad actor in this case could be Russia, Saudi Arabia, or the Chinese government deciding they don't like dissidents. And China does this all the time. All the time. Did you see the story that TikTok, which all the kids, I know the kids love it, but you might tell the kids it's a Chinese company, and they had until recently instructed their moderators to eliminate TikToks from poor people, shabby-looking people, because, well, that's not good. We don't want to see any poor people on TikTok. That's the kind of control that governments want. They want to keep the riffraff out, and the riffraff might include anybody who doesn't think the government is just not super stellar, not sufficiently deferential. The ITU will vote on this. I'm assuming this isn't going to happen, but I just thought I'd mention it. It's really interesting how, I know the bad actors. Yeah, these governments are the bad actors, and sometimes I include our own government. They're pushing through something they call the Earn It Act. Bipartisan, public Republicans and Democrats both love the Earn It Act because the Earn It Act is, well, think of the kids. The Earn It Act is designed, they say, to protect children against trafficking and abuse on the internet, which is admittedly a big problem. But the way they're doing it shows they have other motives. The Earn It Act says companies will be liable for any of the content held on those companies' sites. So Facebook would be liable for anything you post there. That's traditionally not been the case on the internet. Just like the phone company isn't liable for what you say on the phone. That's not their job to listen in. And for a long time, they call it Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. For a long time, internet service providers, and still today, are protected. You're just a common carrier. You're not responsible because A, it would be impossible, and B, it puts them in the position of having to observe everything that goes on. And that is the secret of the Earn It Act. If you want to be protected, you have to make sure nothing bad is going on. In other words, you have to be able to read the content of every message, just like the phone company have to be able to listen to the content of every phone call. And that means encryption is out. Can't have encryption because if I can hide the contents of my Facebook messages or my Apple messages or my WhatsApp messages, if I can encrypt them in such a way that Facebook or Apple can't read them, then they can't do the job the Earn It Act would require them to do. So they have to turn off encryption or, more likely, break it. Say, well, it's encrypted unless we want to read it, which isn't really encrypted, is it? Yeah, I trust Apple, and maybe I don't trust Facebook, but that's not the point. If there's a key, if a key exists, it could leak out, and then bad guys could also use that. So this is why the Earn It Act is a sneaky little thing that they're, while everybody's paying attention, look over there. They're going to sneak that one through, effectively ending end-to-end encryption in the U.S. Other countries have already done that, including China and Russia. Oh, we can't, these guys will act to take advantage of us as quickly as they can. Let's see, what else can we talk about? I don't know what you do with those old computers. You can donate them. There are charities the Christina Foundation that will take old computers, recondition them, Usually they'll wipe the drive, put Linux or something free on there, and give it to charitable organizations that need computing power. Computers, especially the computer you're buying today with no moving parts. The hard drives will wear out, but nowadays with SSDs, they're not going to wear out for a lot longer than the software will be useful for. This is the problem. The computers we're buying today, they are very, very powerful. They'll go for a good 10, 15 years without becoming obsolete, but the software gets obsolete, right? So I love the idea of reconditioning, bringing back an old computer to life by putting a modern operating system on it. And I'm not talking Windows and I'm not talking Mac. I'm talking an open source, free operating system like Linux. The reason is, and Ubuntu is the easiest one to use, especially if you're coming from Windows. It'll be very, very familiar. There are, by the way, hundreds of flavors of Linux. And for all different kinds of users. There's very geeky Linuxes, and there's Linux for novice. Ubuntu is a great kind of choice for anybody who's not used it before. Very easy to use. You install software from a store, just like as you would with Windows or Mac. With a click of the mouse, it's very straightforward. I think, frankly, the days of proprietary commercial software are fading. Believe it or not, maybe for specialized stuff like video editing or photo editing. But for the most part, how are you going to make a word processor better? And the free and open source version of Office, for instance, is as good as Office. How are you going to make Office better? How is Microsoft going to justify that $10 or $15 a month they're charging for Office 365? It's not going to get that much better. It's been done everything you need to do for years, hasn't it? Hasn't it? I mean, what feature is missing? So open source software has really kind of caught up, in other words. It's kind of what and admittedly, they're building on the foundation that the private companies like Microsoft and Apple have created, copying in many cases what Microsoft Office can do. But at this point, there's a lot to be said, and you don't have to, for you, using free open source software. Not only free as in it costs nothing, more importantly, free as in liberty, as in free, as in no commercial entity can spy on you, no government can spy on you. It's yours. You own it. And as companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Facebook get more and more in the mindset that we own you, we don't work for you, you work for us. You're the product. Then really that's how they're thinking, isn't it? When Microsoft puts a big blue window up saying, sorry to interrupt, but you really ought to upgrade to Windows 10, covering everything you're doing, everything you're doing, forcing you, even if you're in the middle of something really important, to pay attention to their ad, that's the time to turn your back on them, I say. And start using software that works for you, not software that employs you. I just think that's wrong. So go, by all means, if you haven't used it before, go try it. It's easy to try Ubuntu. You go to ubuntu.com. Download it. You can put it on a USB stick or a CD or a DVD. You can actually try before you buy. You don't have to install it. You just boot to that USB stick or you boot to the CD. Start up your computer by booting not to your internal hard drive, but to that external device, and you'll be able to use it completely. I mean, it's a little slow because it's running off a USB stick, but it's there, and you can see how it works. You can see if you like it. You can try a lot of different versions of Linux that way. Pick one you like. If you're a Mac user and you want something that feels and looks like Mac, there's Elementary OS that is designed to be a Mac-ish Linux experience. Free, open source, free as in money, but more importantly, free as in liberty. And I think that's where computing is going, to be honest. Anyway, I'm glad you were here, and I'm here, and I'll be here next week, and I hope you'll come by and bring your friends, too, as we talk high tech. Leo Laporte, the tech guy.
Are you ready for another trip into amateur radio history? I'm Bill Continelli, W2XOY, and I'll be back in a moment with another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives, here on This Week in Amateur Radio.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a direct download on our website at www.twiar.net.
Monday, April 15th, 1912, 12:30 a.m. We are over the North Atlantic at 41 degrees 46 minutes north and 50 degrees 14 minutes west. Down below is a majestic ship, the largest and most luxurious ship in the world on its maiden voyage. In the wireless room is a 5-kilowatt Marconi station, and before it sit 2 tired operators who make $20 per month, not as employees of the shipping line, but rather as employees of the Marconi Company. The in-basket is still full of messages, everything from personal telegrams to stock market quotations. They are so busy working Cape Race, Newfoundland, that they didn't even notice the slight grinding jar 30 minutes earlier. As the 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, passed through routine traffic, the captain came in, said the ship had struck an iceberg, and told them to send a distress call at once. The blue spark jumped across the gap as Phillips sent CQD, come quick danger. Send SOS, Bride said. It is the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it. Thus began the moment in history that changed radio. 2 hours later, Jack Phillips and over 1,500 others were dead. The Titanic lay at the bottom of the ocean, and 713 survivors huddled in half-filled lifeboats waiting to be rescued. The tragic errors in the story of the Titanic pointed out the need of wireless regulation. The first ship to answer the distress call was the German liner, the Frankfurt. While the Frankfurt wireless operator was informing his captain, the Carpathia and Cape Race chimed in. When the Frankfurt operator came back to get more information, Phillips tapped back, shut up, you fool, stand by and keep out." While this would seem bizarre by our standards, it made perfect sense to the operators of 1912. The Titanic, Carpathia, and Cape Race were filled with Marconi operators and stations, while the Frankfurt utilized the services of Marconi's German competitor, Telefunken. This commercial war was extended down to the individual operators. No routine traffic would ever pass from a Marconi station to a rival, and even in an emergency, if Marconi stations were available, the others would be shut out. The wireless controversy would continue after the Carpathia picked up the survivors. A wireless message was received, allegedly from the Carpathia, which said, "All passengers of liner Titanic safely transferred to this ship and SS Parisian. C-Com, Titanic being towed by Allen liner Virginian to port." Other wireless messages appeared, also stating that all passengers were safe and the ship was being towed in. There was just one problem. These messages were not coming from the Carpathia. For one thing, her wireless had a maximum range of 150 miles. For another, the Carpathia wireless operator had made only a few transmissions to the Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic and another Marconi operation, in which he had tapped out the list of survivors, some coded messages from Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line, then shut down his station. So complete was the radio silence from the Carpathia that they refused to answer the call from the Navy cruisers sent to the scene by President Taft. The White Star Line, owners of the Titanic, were still insisting that everyone was safe and that the ship had not sunk. But even as they made these claims, they had all the horrific details from the Olympic. And so would the rest of the world, thanks to a 21-year-old operator named David Sarnoff, who managed to detect the faint signals of the Olympic and broke the story. Faced with the truth and hounded by thousands of reporters and outraged relatives of passengers, the White Star Line officials finally broke down and revealed all. Meanwhile, the Carpathia steamed towards New York City. When she passed within range of shore stations, there were frenzied attempts by amateur wireless operators which formed a hissing mixture from which scarcely a complete sentence was intelligible. It didn't matter because the radio silence continued. At the port of New York, the Carpathia was met by Senator William A. Smith of Michigan, a no-nonsense populist who was the chairman of the committee investigating the shipwreck. He immediately slapped subpoenas on everyone possible, including Harold Bride and Harold Cotman, wireless operator on the Carpathia. Marconi himself, who was in the U.S. at the time and had planned on taking the Titanic back to England, was also summoned to appear. The hearings revealed the information given above, plus the disturbing fact that the Californian was just 10 miles from the Titanic. Not only did the Californian not have a full-time wireless operation, but the ship's captain ignored the 8 distress rockets sent up by the Titanic. As to the origin of the false messages concerning the saving of the ship and the passengers, no answer was ever found. However, Senator Smith sarcastically noted that in the interim, the Titanic was quickly reinsured and stock in the Marconi Company jumped from $55 a share to $225 a share. The senator did find out the cause of the Carpathia radio silence. It was Marconi himself. He had sent a wireless message to Bride and Cotman stating, "Marconi Company taking good care of you. Keep your mouth shut. Hold your story. You will get big money. Now clear." It turned out that Marconi had an agreement with the New York Times for an exclusive story. Thus, essential information for desperate relatives and official inquiries from the President of the United States took a back seat to Marconi's interest. When Marconi got on the stand, Senator Smith pounced on him with astonishing vehemence. Marconi had been lionized by the nation, and now the senator was treating him like any other entrepreneur who put profit above the public. Senator Smith was warned that his attack on a man as popular as Marconi was political suicide, but he didn't care. In his obsession with his belief that the unregulated wireless spectrum was partially to blame in the Titanic disaster, he painted Marconi as a man willing to subordinate the public good to his goal of a complete wireless equipment and spectrum monopoly. Senator Smith used the Titanic hearings to condemn the laissez-faire status of the wireless and appealed for the international regulation of radio. On May 8, 1912, Senator Smith introduced a bill in the Senate. Among its provisions, 1. Ships carrying 50 passengers or more must have a wireless set with a minimum range of 100 miles. 2. Wireless sets must have an auxiliary power supply which can operate until the wireless room itself was underwater or otherwise destroyed. And 3. 2 or more operators provide continuous service day and night. In response to the interference generated over the years, and especially when the Carpathia was within range, a provision was added that private stations could not use wavelengths in excess of 200 meters except by special permission. To avoid ownership of the spectrum by the Marconi Company, licenses would now be required issued by the Secretary of Commerce. Each government, marine, or commercial station would be authorized a specific wavelength, power level, and hours of operation. The initial legislation had considered the elimination of all private, non-commercial, that is, amateur stations, but Congress realized that it would be difficult and expensive to enforce. Therefore, since it was a well-known fact that long wavelengths were the best and anything below 250 meters was useless except for local communication, it was decided to compromise and give the amateurs 200 meters where they could work 25 miles maximum and would die out of their own accord in a few years. How the amateurs coped with 200 meters will be our focus next time. I hope you'll join us. This is Bill Continelli, W2XOY, for This Week in Amateur Radio.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
I'm Don Keith, in for KC. I've been a licensed ham since 1961, which means I've been a ham over half of the entire history of amateur radio. I was licensed at the age of 13. And this presentation is entitled In 4KC's Top 5 Get on the Air Quickly Antennas. Well, get on the air quick antennas. To be grammatically correct, it should be quickly because that's an adverb, but I think it sounds better to say get on the air quick antennas. This entire topic actually started several years ago when I noticed I was running into a lot of people who had either gotten their license and never got on the air, or they had gotten their license and got on the air, but just really didn't find that the hobby was for them for various reasons. Or they were interested in ham radio, but they just never got around to getting a license or getting on the air. I decided to start asking questions and see if I could learn why, what kept them from diving deeper into the hobby, what kept them from catching the bug like you and I have, and like so many have over the years. Why did they lose interest and go off someplace else? So I started asking if somebody indicated that they had been a ham or had thought about being a ham or became a ham and never got on the air or had a less than satisfactory experience. Okay, you were interested in ham radio. You may even have gotten your license, but you never dove deeper into the hobby. Why? Why not? And I kept running across 4 or 5 answers that came up very, very often. One of those was just they were unclear or hesitant about how to put a station together. How much does it cost? I can't spend $10 million to become a ham radio operator. And especially with the advent of cell phones, what can this hobby do that my cell phone can't do? Knowing what to do on the air was also a big stumbling block. Once they got the license, they really didn't know where to go or what to do or what the various options were for them out there. You know, we old timers sort of take it for granted that people will dive in and get going and be as enthusiastic about learning new stuff as we were, but that's not necessarily the case. Knowing what to talk about. Okay, let's say I do get on the air with my brand new license. What am I going to talk to this new guy about? Because I know nothing about the hobby. I can barely describe what kind of radio I'm running and what kind of an antenna I've put up, or I really don't know a lot about electronics, or maybe I know a lot about electronics, but I'm afraid my new acquaintance on the air won't. What do you talk about once you get on the hobby? The jargon. Our hobby is over 100 years old. As with any other pastime, it's inevitable that the hobby will develop a lot of jargon, its own language. And, you know, if the first thing you do is you turn on your 2-meter radio and you hear somebody say, well, I've destinated here at the QTH. I think I'll go in and see if the XYL has the old feedback ready. If she doesn't, I may go take a look on 17 and see if I can work the Lac Shedwick expedition, because I need that for my DXCC. 73, what did I just say? If you're a brand new ham, you have no idea. The jargon is actually a very big stumbling block to a lot of people. But the one that kept coming up over and over and over again was putting up an antenna. That's why so many people, when they do take the plunge and actually take the license exam and typically end up here in the USA with a technician class license, the first thing most of the newcomers do is go out and buy an HT. And HT solves a lot of these questions. That little 2-meter handy talkie is a station already. It's got a receiver and a transmitter built in. They can listen to the repeaters and hopefully get a little idea of who is on there, what they're doing, what they talk about, maybe pick up on some of the jargon. And you don't have to worry about an antenna, because there's a little device on top of that 2-meter rig that, well, we call it a rubber ducky. Some of us call it a dummy load, a little helical antenna that probably takes about 2/3 or 3/4 of the signal that you have available and burns it up. So the introduction into the hobby with that HT is not necessarily a good one. I decided to address this with several chapters in some of my books. Get on the Air Now is the one that actually addresses each one of these roadblocks. And I'll talk just a little bit about that toward the end of the presentation. But I also put together this particular chapter for several of the books, and also did an article on it for the eham.net website, and it's still available there. It's also available on my ham radio website, n4kc.com. If you scroll to the bottom and take a look at the articles, you'll see one on the top 5 get on the air quick antennas. Well, first of all, this is my opinion of what the top 5 get on the air quick antennas are. And the criterion for my list, since this is my presentation, was first of all, it needs to be relatively simple to put up. Nobody wants to get out and have to do a whole bunch of tree climbing or tower building or that sort of thing as a brand new ham. Secondly, because of the situation most new hams find themselves in, it needs to be as stealthy as necessary. It does not need to be too obtrusive or something that will necessarily require approval by a homeowners association or a town engineer or anything like that. It should work reasonably well, because the reason we're putting up this one of these antennas in the first place is because we want to overcome that objection that putting up an antenna is too much trouble, too difficult, and too dangerous. But we want it to give a good impression of the hobby. We want people to be able to make contacts with that antenna. It needs to be easy and inexpensive for even a rank newcomer who knows nothing at all about the hobby to be able to build or to buy it and put it up in a way that it will give that satisfactory experience. I can't tell you how many times I've heard new hams ask, what's the quickest, easiest way I can get an antenna up and get on the air and start trying out that new license. I've heard old timers come back with, well, you need to go buy you a bunch of aluminum and build yourself a beam. Or you need to put up a fan dipole. Well, a fan dipole may be a perfectly good antenna, but they're very, very pesky to try to get tuned right if you use it on multiple bands. In other words, they're giving advice that might apply to somebody who's been a ham for a long, long time. And remember, this is a total newcomer. And I assume a lot of you who are taking in this presentation fall into that category. It needs to be something that you can put up and do yourself, and inexpensive. I'll put a lot of emphasis on that with my choices for the top 5. And maybe just accidentally, these top 5 antennas will encourage a newcomer to be curious, to learn more about antennas, how they work, how you adjust, how you can use that antenna. And if you don't like it, you put up a second one. If it works better than the first one, you take the first one down, or do like me and just keep putting up antennas. A bird cannot fly through my backyard without risking his life and limb. It's just the nature of falling in love with experimenting with antennas. And if it encourages somebody to learn more, that's a good thing. That's exactly what happened to me. I was just trying to figure out how to get back on the air after a hiatus, and I'd really not paid a lot of attention to antennas in the past, but once I did, I really got interested in how these things work, how to make them work better, and how to get a more satisfactory experience out of the hobby.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
Now, these are not in any particular order, by the way. It all depends on what your needs are, what your knowledge is, what your skill level is. How good are you with a screwdriver and a soldering iron? That'll determine which ones of these will fit best with what you want to do. Number 1 on the list, not necessarily in your hearts or in ranking order, is the plain old wire dipole fed with coaxial cable. The invention of the coax cable was one of the most wonderful things to happen to radio communications, and maybe also one of the worst. I'll mention those as we go along here. A dipole antenna is simply 2 pieces of copper wire, typically copper, because copper is a good conductor of electromagnetic energy. Each one of those 2 pieces of wire is 1/4 wavelength long for the frequency on which you intend to use that particular antenna. Thankfully, and you may have learned this when you studied for your license exam, there's a simple formula for determining how long the entire antenna will be. Then you just divide that by 2 to get the length of each one of those 2 pieces of wire. You take 468. I won't go into why that's the magic number for this presentation, but trust me, 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz. Therefore, if you are going to cut an antenna for pretty much the higher end of 75 meters, you might divide 468 by 3.95. Or if you want to cut it for the middle of the band, for 3.9 or 3.8, divide that into 468. That'll give you a number. You divide that by 2, and that's the length of those 2 pieces of wire. In the middle, you have a center insulator. That center insulator can be one that's manufactured for the purpose of being a center insulator, and there are plenty of them out there. You'll see them at Hamfest or just about any place you want to look. You will also be able to make something. If you have something that's sturdy that you want to use that's non-conductive, it can be a center insulator. You don't want it to be too broad, too long, too wide. Inch or 2 would be fine. Couple of inches would work just fine. And you will need an insulator at each end of the wire. And you string that up, put the center insulator in the middle, you put the other 2 insulators on the ends, then you use rope or something else, preferably non-conductive, to tie that to a couple of supports. That dipole antenna can also be an inverted V, where you will have a support in the middle. Then the other 2 wires will sag down to much shorter supports. You want to get that at least 6 or 7 feet off the ground so nobody gets into it. Or in my part of the world, you don't want anybody to, you don't want the deer to get their antlers caught in the wire on the ends. That's called an inverted V for obvious reasons, because the 2 wires form an upside down V. Then you will take a piece of coax. What kind of coax? Way beyond the scope of this presentation. RG58, RG8, LMR400, a lot of numbers and names that you can look for. If you're going to run considerable power, you probably want to use something larger like LMR400 for your coax. If you're not going to run more than 100 watts, and you're not going to have too long a run, and you're not going to use it on too high a frequency, you can use just regular old RG8X, which is pretty good coax for that sort of an antenna. You take the center conductor of that antenna and attach it to one of the wires at the center, and you take the outer shield on that coax and you attach it to the other wire, and you've got a dipole antenna. Now, one little caveat here, and I'm going to look at the pros and cons of each one of these antennas. A dipole is a balanced antenna. That should be fairly obvious. Both wires are the same length on either side of that center insulator. Coax is an unbalanced feed line. So you're going to have a balanced antenna being fed by an unbalanced piece of feed line, the coax. So most people typically and wisely will use what is called a balun. That is a balanced, unbalanced transformer. And if you put that transformer between the connection to each one of the wires at the top, and then you just put your coax directly to the output of the balun, then you have accomplished changing over from a balanced antenna to an unbalanced feed line. And there at the center where the feed line attaches is the best place to do that. That will keep RF off the outside of the shield of the antenna in a lot of cases, and feeding back into your shack and biting you on the lip when you touch the microphone on the radio. That is, number one, the wire dipole fed with coax. The pros of this antenna: it's cheap, it's easy, and I guarantee you, if you have trees or bushes around, it's almost invisible to your neighbors, maybe even to the spouse. I don't guarantee that. It only takes 1 or 2 supports. Supports on the ends would be 2. Does not necessarily need a support in the middle, although a lot of people will put one there just for security's sake, and especially if you're using a long run of heavy coax. If you only use 1 support in the middle and make an inverted V, you technically have supports on the end, but the height of those are not critical. This antenna will work quite well on the band for which you cut it, and it will also work quite well on the odd harmonics. So if you cut this antenna for 7.1 megahertz, the 40 meter band, it'll work pretty well on 15 meters. But unfortunately, most of our bands are no longer odd harmonics of each other. It may still work on those bands, but it won't be optimal because it's going to fall outside the actual ham band. The cons of this kind of antenna, the dipole, it really needs to be high above ground, at least a quarter wavelength, if you intend to work a lot of DX. If you're too close to the ground, you become a cloud warmer, as they call it. That actually has its advantages if you want limited area coverage with a good strong signal. But if you're intending to use this antenna for DX, you really do need to get it at least a quarter and preferably a half wavelength above the ground. If you happen to have it above salt water, that's a whole different situation. But most of us don't live on salt water. This antenna is somewhat directional. The pattern is going to resemble a figure 8 with the nulls off the ends of the antenna. So you need to be sure you orient it in such a way that you're going to take advantage of that directional characteristic. If you're going to use the antenna on bands for which you didn't cut it, or for bands that are not odd harmonic bands, that is an odd multiple of the primary band that you cut it for, then you're probably going to require a tuner. And that tuner preferably needs to be at the feed point, which raises a whole bunch of other issues that almost would disqualify this antenna, because getting a tuner out there at the feed point, getting that tuner power so it can do its thing automatically, that gets to be real complicated. The reason for all this is, one of the negative things about coax is if it is looking at a high standing wave ratio at the feed point, then you're going to have quite a bit of loss coming back and going to the antenna of RF if it is not a resonant antenna. So for that reason, you either want a tuner at the feed point of the antenna, or you primarily only going to be able to use the antenna on its resonant band and the odd harmonic bands where it would also be close to resonance. Those are the negatives. To me, the positives still outweigh that, because it is very simple and easy to put up and easy to keep up in the air, and it'll give you a good satisfactory experience.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
Number 2, the wire dipole, but fed with parallel or open wire feed line. This is almost identical to the one I just showed you, except instead of feeding it with coax, that wonderful stuff that's easy to work with and easy to get into the shack and just screws right onto the radio or to the antenna tuner, we're going to use open wire or ladder line feed line. Number of reasons for this it we'll talk about, but you will cut this antenna for the lowest frequency you intend to operate. That's the old 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz that we talked about with the dipole. Or you make it as long as will fit into where you're going to be able to put up the antenna. Hopefully it's going to be good usable antenna for the lowest frequency band, the highest wavelength band that you intend to operate on. Just put one side of the balanced feed line to one side of the antenna and solder the other side to the other side of the antenna. Notice that I do not put a balun at the feed point. We don't really care a lot, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Besides, the typical impedance of a dipole antenna is going to be anywhere from 60 to 75 ohms or so, and you're feeding it with 50 ohm coax, or you're feeding it with 450 ohm ladder line or 300 ohm window line or whatever. You've got a pretty bad mismatch there. But Don, you just said that it matters that you have a high SWR and that you really need a resonant antenna. Well, not necessarily, because the nature of that balanced feed line, that open wire or ladder line, is that it is not nearly as susceptible to loss from high standing wave ratios. The advantages of this dipole fed with the open wire or ladder line, the same advantages as you get with a dipole. It is very stealthy. It works very well. With an external tuner beyond the one that's built into most of our transceivers these days, it will work well on just about every band that you try it on if your antenna tuner is wide enough. And that dipole that was cut for one particular frequency will work even on the even multiples and the odd multiples, and where the antenna is decidedly not resonant. That's because that balanced feed line is not susceptible to the high losses that you get with a high standing wave ratio. The cons, well, they're the same as the dipole. It is a basically a directional antenna, although you get, if your feed line has any radiation at all, you'll get a little vertical element that's not directional, but typically it's still going to be a figure 8. Now, I mentioned that you don't need a balun at the feed point. You do need some sort of way of transferring over to an unbalanced antenna when you get to the radio or to most tuners, external tuners, because they're expecting a coax connector. And if you're using 450 ohm window line, the output of most amateur radio transceivers is 50 ohms. You're going to want to step that down. If you're using 450 ohm line down to 50, you'd need a 4-to-1 balun or something like that to make the transition. I got to say, though, if you use an antenna like this on a lot of different frequencies, you'll be surprised how just a simple 4-to-1 balun, not an 8-to-1 or a 9-to-1 or anything odd, will work just fine. Because again, the SWR doesn't matter that much as long as your tuner can find a match and the radio is perfectly willing to transfer that energy through the antenna matchbox to the feed line and the antenna. No matter how many trips that signal makes up and down the transmission line, it's still eventually going to get emitted, and it will work just fine, and you'll get a good satisfactory experience. But you do need some sort of balun that will transfer that over. I have one of these antennas, and I use a 4-to-1 balun, and I find that it will actually match up with my auto tuner on every frequency I've tried to match it. Works fine. I have a big loop, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that actually works fine with a 1-to-1 balun, and the tuner can find a match on that thing just about any place it wants to find a match. But you will have to have a balun somewhere in there to make the transition from, in this case, balanced to unbalanced, which is the output of your radio and in most cases the tuner. Open wire feed line does have its quirks. It does have its oddities. You can't just run it along the ground. You can't tie it down a tower, touching the tower. You really need to keep that feed line at least the width of the feed line and maybe a little more away from any metal object, and certainly no long run along the gutters or tied to the gutters on the house or anything metallic. You can't just coil it up on the ground because you got too much or whatever. Getting it into the house is an issue with me. Getting into the shack, it has to pass by a bunch of air conditioning gunk, and it also has to come along with a phone line and a whole bunch of coaxial cables. So I have different ways of doing that. In my case, I go to either a 4-to-1 or a 1-to-1 balun, and then I have a very short run of coax into the house, into the shack, and that's what hooks up to the antenna switch. Getting that feed line inside to the shack can be problematic, just because you don't want it anywhere near any sort of metallic object, because it will mess up the pattern. It'll mess up your impedance if you do that. Number 3, the old full wave horizontal loop, or the sky wire, which sounds like good marketing. I happen to have one of these. I've got both. I have the number 2. I don't have number 1. I don't have a dipole fed by coax anymore. I do have the number 2 up in the air and use it quite a bit, primarily on 75 and 80 meters. Number 3 is the full wave sky loop. That's just a single piece of wire with the ends joined at an insulator. That's the feed point where that insulator is. And then you feed it either with coax or open wire feed line attached across the insulator to those 2 ends of the antenna. You mean the antenna is shorted? Yes, it is. It's one piece of wire, one continuous piece of wire. The formula for figuring out how big that piece of wire is, if you want it to be one wavelength, which is a very handy and effective length for a loop, then the formula is 1005 over the frequency in megahertz. That's going to make it one wavelength long. And note that most diagrams you see is in the shape of a square or a rectangle, and you'll often see skywire loops in the shape drawn as a circle. It does not have to be either one. It can be whatever configuration it takes that you have supports to do it. My particular one has probably 10 or 12 supports around the backyard, and it's all haphazard. But it's a very effective antenna, stealthy. Yep, it's hard to see one of those in the trees. My big old loop, which is 520 feet long, it's a lot of wire. But that's the only way I could get on 160 meters. I did not have a path for a 260-foot dipole. So I got out, walked around the yard, and noticed, if I go all the way around my lot, maybe encroach just a little bit into the trees on my neighbor's lot, I would be able to put up the loop. And once I got it up there, I can't even tell that it's there. I have to actually go out and walk around the yard looking up to try to make sure the antenna is still in the air. It will also fit, as I say, where others might not. You'd be surprised how much room you have around a standard size city lot, which mine is. The loop antenna is very quiet. It makes a good receiving antenna, even if you're not hearing a signal as strongly as you might on some other kind of antenna. You can actually hear a weaker signal much better because it's extremely quiet. It really does resist man-made noise, which is typically vertical in nature. If you feed it with open wire feed line, just like the dipole, it can be a very effective antenna on a wide array of frequencies. My little MFJ 998 auto tuner will find a match any place I've ever tried to match it. And because it's so much wire and because of the nature of the loop, as you increase the frequency, double it each time, or each harmonic frequency, or each higher band, you get more and more gain lobes, and those gain lobes become much, much stronger. And if the station you're trying to work happens to fall into one of those gain lobes, you're going to be able to work him with an extremely strong signal, and you're going to be able to hear him very well just because of the nature of the pattern of this antenna. The cons of the loop, well, it's a lot of wire to keep in the air, and it will require multiple support points. In some places, my antenna runs through trees and limbs and leaves, and I can't help it, but I've got it up there as high as I can get it, which is not very high. Lightning and static electricity just love the loop antenna. If you got 520 or 560 feet of copper wire in the air, as I do, it really does love the lightning. In some areas where the humidity is very low, you get a dust storm or you get blowing snow, you can actually have a charge build up on that much wire that could be lethal at any point along the feed line. So you want to, as I do, make sure that you have lightning arresting, or in my case, I use regular old double banana plugs, and just when I get finished using the antenna, I unplug them, I drop one end on the ground, and that eliminates the need for a whole lot of lightning protection. And I will never operate if there is lightning or thunder anywhere within 20, 25 miles of where I am.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
I talked about those gain lobes and how neat those are and how they give you a real strong signal in some areas. Well, with each lobe, there is also a null. And if the station you're trying to work happens to be in one of those nulls, you may never hear him, he may never hear you. And so far, I have not figured any way to rotate a 560-foot long piece of copper wire. But it's still a great antenna, and a lot of folks use the loop for a lot of good reasons. I just wish I could get mine about 50 or 60 feet higher. I'm working on it, but I don't know how to do it. Number 4, the much maligned G5RV and also the ZS6 BKW variant. This is basically a dipole, but the dipole is fed with a certain length of known impedance, open wire feed line, or ladder line. That is a matching stub. The antenna itself has a much higher or lower impedance than what you want to use, but that matching stub at a certain point on the stub is about 50 ohms, and that's where you attach coaxial cable. You don't necessarily need a balun. Some people will use a 1-to-1 there just to make sure that it's a smooth transition from unbalanced to balanced. And then your coax goes on and ties into your radio or your tuner with a coax feed, so you don't have to worry about the ladder line. The pros and cons of the G5RV, and you'll hear all sorts of bad stuff about this antenna, but it really is a very effective antenna. It's shorter than a dipole, which helps a lot of people who are space challenged and don't want to put up a bunch of wire. It'll work well on several bands. Mine loads up just fine, and it's a shorter ZS6 BKW version. It works just fine on 10, 12, 17, 20, and 40 meters. It will not load up even with my fine auto tuner on 75 or 80 meters, or at least no place I've found there, because it's much too short for that. The antenna is relatively easy to build, and there are quite a few inexpensive versions that you can buy online. Just don't believe the hype about it being an all-band antenna. You know, a 10-penny nail is an all-band antenna if you've got a tuner that will find a match to that 10-penny nail, but it's not going to be a very effective antenna. Again, those bands 10, 12, 17, 20, and 40 is my particular G5RV seems to work well. It's a good little 40-meter antenna. You can build one yourself, or you can buy versions that are built in kits, including the feed line and everything else. My two G5RVs that I've had were both from the Wireman, the little kit he sells. And I think I paid about $25 for the first one. It's about twice that now. Copper's gotten a lot more expensive. The first one lasted 10 years until a tree limb took it down. It had been up there for a long time, so I went ahead and trashed that one and bought a brand new one from the Wireman. I've been using it for about 8 or 9 years now, and it still works fine. The cons, again, it is not, despite what the marketers might say, an all-band antenna unless you've got a really, really good tuner that can find a match. And even if it finds a match, it may not allow you to make a lot of contacts. If you use a long run of coax, once you make the switch over from the ladder line matching stub, you can have loss in that coax if the SWR is very high, just like you can with a dipole. And the measurement for that matching stub needs to be fairly precise, because you've got to find that point where it's closest to 50 ohms on the widest array of potential frequencies on which you're going to be using the antenna. The Wireman puts a little chart in there that I found to be very accurate. And if you cut it to that, go do some antenna analyzing with it, you'll find that it works just fine where it's supposed to work just fine. And it works lousy where it's not supposed to work at all. So there you go. Number 5, and I'll hurry up. I've used over my time already. The quarter wavelength vertical is just a single vertical element. It's a quarter wavelength for the band on which you intend to use it. And the frequency, or the formula rather, for finding the length of that vertical element is 234, half of 468 note, over the frequency in megahertz. And typically it's going to have ground radials. These are pieces of wire that are cut for the lowest band that you're going to use this antenna on. Or you can use elevated radials and mount this thing on a roof or a tower or whatever, pretty much making it a ground plane. And there you need preferably 2 radials for each band that are resonant. So they're going to be the same length as the vertical element. That's a quarter wavelength vertical. The pros, it is very simple. It takes, what, 1/100 of an inch, very little space, and it is relatively stealthy. I've got mine hidden behind a magnolia tree, and nobody's ever mentioned it being there. None of the neighbors, certainly not the town that I live in. The angle of radiation, we haven't talked a lot about that, but that's one of the reasons you want to get those dipoles and G5RVs and loops and all those up as high as you can. You want that angle of radiation to be the lowest for good DX. That's generally around 15 to 20 degrees above the horizon. The angle of radiation for a typical vertical is pretty good. And you can use traps or coils or other magic stuff to make this a multi-band antenna. And there are a lot of relatively inexpensive verticals on the market that are multi-band because they use traps. Mine is a Hustler 4BTV. I paid $50 for it from a guy that I know that was getting rid of it. And I've had it up for probably 15 years and it still works just fine. It uses traps, so the antenna is resonant on 10, 15, 20, and 40. and it works okay. A lot of people sell these things, and they're all pretty good antennas. The cons, you do need radials. I don't care what the marketing people say, no radials necessary. Well, for a true vertical, you do need radials. If they're on the ground, they really do need to be buried just a little bit to keep the deer and the neighborhood kids and my grandkids out of them, and the lawnmower, because the lawnmower loves to have copper wire wrapped around the blade. The cons, really not a lot. The biggest one is it radiates equally poorly in all directions. That's the old saw about the vertical. It's omnidirectional. You don't have any gain in any direction. That could be a plus. You don't know which direction the band is open to, or it's open to different directions, and you want to work them all. You can certainly do it with the vertical, but you don't have any gain really in any direction. And it is very susceptible to man-made noise. You know, I said most man-made noise is vertically polarized, and the vertical will definitely pick that up. Those are my top 5 get on the air quick antennas. The dipole, coax fed. The dipole fed with open wire balanced line. The horizontal loop, typically 1 wavelength. People always say, well, what if I put up a 2 wavelength loop or a 5 wavelength loop? Just remember, you're going to have a lot more of those lobes and nulls than you would have with a 1 wavelength loop on all the succeeding higher frequencies. The old G5RV, and maybe the simplest of all, and maybe the most stealthy of all, is the vertical. Again, not in any particular order, depending on what you're looking for, what you got, what your technical expertise is, how much room you have, and a lot of other factors. Well, I'll leave you with a couple of things. First of all, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, just drop me an email, don@donkeith.com, n4kc@donkeith.com. And look for me on the air. I'm primarily on 6 meters and 160 nowadays. I'm trying to get my 100 countries on those. I'm going after my 9-band DXCC, and if I can get 30 more on 160, I'll have it.
Now celebrating our 22nd year keeping the amateur radio community informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at www.twiar.net.
AMSAT News is here this week from Bruce Page, KK5DO. Alan, BA1DU, had posted on the AMSAT bulletin board that CAMSAT was readying another satellite, CAS-10 or XW4. They've had very good success with their lines of CAS-XW satellites. This satellite is scheduled to launch on November 6th. It is an 8U CubeSat. It supports a linear transponder with VHF up and UHF down and a 30 megahertz bandwidth. It will be active during the life cycle of the satellite. It has a CW telemetry beacon and a Morse code CW beacon. This will make it easier to get a lot of specific information in a short amount of time in a short format on CW string. A camera will store pictures by sending a DTMF tone to the satellite, and it will transmit that picture for downloading. The download link will be on 435.180 megahertz with an uplink of 145.87 megahertz, and telemetry will be on 435.725 megahertz, and the CW telemetry beacon is on 435.575 megahertz. That satellite will be launched from the China Tiangong space station and will be operational immediately after orbit.
It's time for the weekly propagation forecast report, brought to us each week by Ted Cook, K7RA, in Seattle, Washington, who reports that sunspot numbers and solar flux increased this reporting week from September 29th all the way through October 5th, as expected, with the solar cycle progressing toward a probable peak in the summer of 2025. Average daily sunspot numbers increased from 105.1 to 111.4, and the average daily 10.7 centimeter solar flux went from 138.4 to 149.2. Compare this to a year ago, when the average daily sunspot number was just 59.4 and solar flux was 89.8. This last week, there were 2 new sunspot groups on September 30th, 1 more on October 1st, 3 on October 3rd, and 1 more appeared on Thursday, October 6th. Hams have been noticing improved 10-meter propagation with openings lasting all day now that the autumnal equinox passed 2 weeks ago with higher sunspot numbers. So looking ahead, the predicted solar flux is 154 on October 8th and 9th, then 152 and 150 on October 10th and 11th, 148 on October 12th all the way through the 14th, 130 on October 15th, 135 on October 17th and 18th, and 140 on October 18th. The predicted planetary A index, looking at that now, will be 10, 12, and 8 on October 8th through the 10th, 5 on October 11th to the 13th, 8 on October 14th, 10 on October 15th and 16th, and then 8 on October 17th all the way through the 19th. By the way, on October 2nd, SpaceWeather.com announced a big dangerous sunspot numbered AR3112, one of the biggest in years, and has just rotated over the sun's eastern horizon. They predict this could produce 2 weeks of high solar activity.
In radio contesting this week, again, many opportunities. October 8th and 9th, the Macathan RTTY contest, that's digital. On October 8th, the QRP ARCI Fall QSO Party, that's CW. On October 8th, the VU Nevada QSO Party, that's CW phone and digital. And on October 8th and 9th, the Oceana DX contest, that's CW. And on October 8th, the Microwave Spall Sprint, that's CW phone and digital. And some upcoming section, state, and division conventions on October 7th and 8th. The Melbourne Hamfest, that's hosting the ARRL Florida State Convention. That's in Melbourne, Florida. Also on October 7th and 8th, the Slidell EOC Hamfest, hosting the ARRL Louisiana State Convention. That's in Slidell, Louisiana. October 7th and 9th, the ARRL Rocky Mountain Division Convention. That's in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And on October 9th, the Nutmeg Hamfest, hosting the ARRL Connecticut State Convention in North Haven, Connecticut.
The Radio Society of Great Britain will host the Transatlantic Centenary Tests during December 2022. The international event celebrates the centenary of the transatlantic success of the RSGB in December 1922. On December 24, 1922, the very first verified amateur radio signal from Europe was received in North America. The signal originated from the RSGB station G5WS at Wandsworth in South London as part of the third transatlantic tests. Unlike the tests of the 1920s, which consisted of one-way communication, the December 2022 tests will encourage worldwide two-way communication with the United Kingdom and Crown dependencies. There will be a series of awards available for making contacts with those who are activating special call signs. For this centenary celebration, the RSGB has renewed 5 call signs, which they held in the 1920s. G5WS from the 1922 tests, which was the first to get across. G5AT from the 1923 tests. G6XX from the 1923 tests. G6ZZ, used for the first amateur tests on a moving railway car in 1924. G3DR, Scottish Highlands Call. These historic call signs will be activated by RSGB members and clubs using G5WS, G5AT, G6XX, G6ZZ, G6DR England, GM5WS Scotland, GW5WS Wales, GU5WS Guernsey, GD5WS Isle of Man, GJ5WS Jersey, and GI5WS Northern Ireland. Full details on how to participate are available on the RSGB website.
ARRL Director Emeritus Dr. Thomas W. Comstock, N5TC, passed away on September 22, 2022. He was 91 years old. Comstock graduated from Texas A&M University in 1952 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force. One of his 4 domestic assignments was with the Texas A&M ROTC program in College Station, Texas. While there, Comstock received his master's degree and Ph.D. He retired from the U.S. Air Force in 1972 as a lieutenant colonel and returned to Texas A&M, where he taught in the Industrial Technology and Industrial Distribution departments. He also published 2 books. When he retired from Texas A&M, Comstock was conferred the status of Professor Emeritus of the university. During the 1970s, Comstock became an avid amateur radio operator. He served as ARRL West Gulf Division Vice Director from 1980 to 1991 and as a director from 1991 to 1997. He was also a director of the ARRL Foundation and the Scholarship Committee. In recognition of his service to ARRL, the Board of Directors named Comstock as Director Emeritus in July 2012. Comstock was also a member of the ARRL Maxim Society in the Ambassador class.
Jamboree on the Air and Jamboree on the Internet is the world's largest scout event taking place on the Internet and over the airwaves. Held every year in October, the event connects millions of young people around the world for a full weekend of online activities that promote friendship and global citizenship. In 2022, JOTA and JODI take place from October 14th through the 16th. For the JOTA side of the event, scouts and guides all over the world connect with each other by means of amateur radio. Shortwave and digital radio signals carry their voices to virtually any corner of the world. It's the sheer excitement of having a live conversation with a fellow scout or guide at some other place in the world that attracts so many young people to this event. Event planning information or resources can be found on the K2BSA website at k2bsa.net. Register your station today at jotajoti.info and check out the virtual campsite where you can find lots of activities for this travel-free jamboree.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a podcast at our website, www.twiar.net, and streamed worldwide via Spotify and iHeartMedia.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. Over the past while, I've been discussing the Amateur's Code and its place in our community. I've shown that it was published in 1927 despite credits to the contrary, and it's possible that it existed since 1923. I've discussed the original code, how it evolved, and what changes have been made across the decades since. I'd like to take this opportunity to compare the original from 1927 to a revision that I've constructed using the various versions that have been published since. Originally, I was going to use the current 2022 version in the ARRL handbook to discuss this, but it's completely different from the one shown on the ARRL website today, which appears to be more recent, that it made little sense to pick one over the other. Back to 1927, or 1923, if you like, written by Paul M. Segal, 9 Echo Echo Alpha, or Whiskey 9 Echo Echo Alpha, Director, Rocky Mountain Division, and General Counsel of ARRL. The Amateur's Code. 1. The amateur is gentlemanly. He never knowingly uses the air for his own amusement in such a way as to lessen the pleasure of others. He abides by the pledges given by the ARRL in his behalf to the public and the government. 2. The amateur is loyal. He owes his amateur radio to the American Radio Relay League, and he offers it his unswerving loyalty. 3. The amateur is progressive. He keeps his station abreast of science. It is built well and efficiently. His operating practice is clean and regular. 4. The amateur is friendly, slow and patient sending when requested. Friendly advice and counsel to the beginner. Kindly assistance and cooperation for the broadcast listener. These are the marks of the amateur spirit. 5. The amateur is balanced. Radio is his hobby. He never allows it to interfere with any of the duties he owes to his home, his job, his school, or his community. 6. The amateur is patriotic. His knowledge and his station are always ready for the service of his country and his community. It has a certain quality about it. Leaving aside that it's written with a male radio amateur in mind, it represents what the character Dennis Denuto in the 1997 Australian movie The Castle refers to as, it's just the vibe of the thing. I present to you an updated version of the code in an attempt at preserving that vibe, whilst taking into account that we're not in 1923 any longer. The radio amateur is considerate and respectful, never knowingly behaving in such a way as to lessen the pleasure of others. The radio amateur is loyal, offering encouragement and participation to the global amateur community. The radio amateur is progressive, keeping abreast of science, striving to build and operate their station above reproach. The radio amateur is friendly, patient, offering friendly advice and counsel to the beginner, kindly assistance, cooperation, and consideration for the interests of others. These are the hallmarks of the amateur spirit. The radio amateur is balanced. Radio is a hobby, never allowing it to interfere with any of the duties owed to home, work, school, or community. The radio amateur is supportive. Knowledge, station, and skills always ready for service to country and community. Hopefully you've followed along with the evolution of this discussion and find the reasoning for it as compelling as I do. Of course, this is just one perspective on what a revised amateur's code might look like, and I'm offering it as a topic of discussion to the entire global amateur radio community. I hope that it provides food for thought, talking points, and encouragement to ask questions. I will reiterate my thanks to the worldradiohistory.com website, where you can find many of the earliest editions of the ARRL handbook. If you have any of the missing editions, or better copies than those available, I'd encourage you to share them to continue to preserve the history of our community. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima Alpha Bravo.
The amateur radio satellite EIR-SAT-1 features in a BBC News report this week, and the launch window is now planned for mid-January to mid-February 2023 from the European spaceport at Kourou in French Guiana, South America. EIR-SAT-1, which stands for Educational Irish Research Satellite No. 1, was designed and developed, built and tested at University College Dublin. It will be launched 520 kilometres into the sky and will orbit the Earth for about 5 years before being returned to the university. The IARU coordinated downlink frequency is 437.100 MHz. This is Ireland's first satellite, and it's hoped that the device will reveal more about how the universe is formed. Dr. David McKeown, Assistant Professor in the School of Mechanical and Materials Engineering at University College Dublin, was Engineering Manager on the project. He said that when neutron stars and black holes collide, lots of energy is generated, which goes across the universe. The satellite will be able to detect this and helps to better understand what is happening. Dr. McKeown said that the project is really for the students. They've been able to develop, build and test the satellite, which it is hoped can grow the space industry in Ireland. Dr. McKeown said that the project was really for the students. They've been able to develop, build and test the satellite, which it is hoped will grow the space industry in Ireland. With EIR-SAT-1 being the first satellite, the Irish government has to confirm it recognises it as an Irish mission and intends to register the satellite on the United Nations Register of Objects Launched into Outer Space. Dr. McKeown hopes that the project will have laid the groundwork for larger satellites in the future. You can read more in the BBC News report at www.bbc.co.uk.
There was perhaps no better way to mark the occasion of Engineering Day in September than to hold an amateur radio workshop on a university campus and provide some eye-opening lessons for tech students there. AMSAT India's regional coordinator Rajesh Vagadia, VU2EXP, did just that at Marwadi University in Gujarat and in 4 hours, the 80 students from the Information and Communications Technology Department, along with a special team assigned to a student project, gained insights into amateur radio as well as ham radio satellites. For that one special team of students, the timing could not have been better. The university recently announced that they will be building a satellite to be launched by the ISRO. The workshop provided some bonus preparatory work for them. The more terrestrial-minded demonstrations, from digital modes and VHF-FM to slow-scan television, were conducted with the help of Sakshi Vagadia, VU3-EXP, and Shyama Vagadia, VU3-WHG, who is also a part of the student satellite team. Workshops also covered such topics as the jargon of amateur radio, operating in the Parks of the Air and Islands on the Air award programs, high-altitude balloon tracking, and, of course, CW. Just as every amateur contact on the air is usually followed up with a QSL of some sort, this workshop is not the end of the contact with this campus. Rajesh reported that the university administrators were so pleased that AMSAT India can expect to come back to conduct more programs.
Members of the FIST's CW Club in the UK know that you don't need a reason to declare it's time for a QSO party. So organizers have declared October 22nd as the date for the club's official autumn gathering. The FIST's website says this is simply an opportunity to rekindle old friendships and make new ones. This means that non-members and radio operators who send QRS are just as welcome as our FIST's regulars. The QSO party takes place on that date between 1900 and 2359 UTC. As the club points out on its website, this is an activity that won't help anyone score points or add another certificate to their ever-growing collection, but on the other hand, you might just make some new friends. The website offers a few encouraging words by adding, let's wheel out the homebrew, the military gear, the old stuff and the new, and let's just chat with each other. More information is available at fists.co.uk.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts. And now, with his segment on tower climbing and antenna safety, here is Arizona's own Greg Stoddard, KF9MP.
Over the years I've been a tower climber, I've had to work at night. And when I tell people I climb at night, I usually get more comments from that than I do from climbing in general. Most of the towers I've been on are close to populated areas, and since most populated areas are full of streetlights, I've noticed that most of these towers are easily seen at night, and I often do not use my headlamp while climbing up the tower. Now this may only apply to towers less than 200 feet tall or job sites on the tower lower than 200 feet. Since the light from streetlights shines upwards, even a small amount of light usually makes the tower stand out boldly against a black sky. Now it may not appear when you first arrive at the tower that it's easy to see, but after your eyes adjust to the dark, it will become a lot easier. When climbing downwards, the lighting is different, and here is where I use my headlamp. I wear a headband type flashlight I purchased at our local Walmart for about $8. I also bring along extra AA batteries. If you were going to do a job that would last more than 20 minutes or so, or higher than ambient light would allow you to climb upwards without extra light, I would recommend a style of light with an external gel cell type battery. Also, a surprising amount of light can come from the moon. And when you get above the streetlights, you may be surprised how well you can see with no added light. Some climbers do not like to work on wet towers, which is understandable. Lots of times at night, dew forms on towers, which can make them dripping wet. And I've noticed over the years that this wetness usually only goes to about 20 or 30 feet or so above the ground and then stops. Some of the best scenery I've seen is late at night on a tower. At night, fog can make the visibility poor on the ground, but often stops before you get to the spot on the tower you need to get to. Climbing above the fog on a night with a full moon can provide some spectacular views, as the fog looks thick enough like you could step off the tower and walk on top of it. Too bad this would be nearly impossible to photograph. Finally, I've noticed that Mother Nature tends to calm down at night, say after midnight. If there's a job you've been needing to get done, but wind or storms have kept you off the tower, check out the weather after midnight, then give it a try. Don't forget that ground crew, and never climb alone, especially at night. Also, don't forget extra batteries for your flashlight. And don't use the kind of flashlight you hold in your hand. Spotlights on the ground will only blind you on the tower, so don't let people shine lights up at you. When I do a night job, I often call the local police to let them know I'll be there so I don't get a light shine in my eyes. Plus, if they're bored and the donut shops are closed, they may even offer to be a ground crew for you. Now remember, tower work at any height can easily become deadly. Money spent on books, videos, and climbing gear is well worth the investment. This is Greg Stoddard, KF9MP, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
The Geratol net is back. That's spelled Geratol, which stands for Greetings Extra Radio Amateur Tired of Operating Lately, except after a few months of not operating lately. The net is now back officially on the air. You can find extra-class operators checking in every night at 3.668 megahertz, starting at 0100 UTC. Now in its 50th year of operation, the net is making the occasion by adding anniversary awards to an array of awards it already confers. To be eligible, hams must make 50 contacts, one for each year of the net's lifetime, during a session of the Geratol net. These contacts must be logged during the period of the net's anniversary year. The contacts must include the club station W0NL. For details about the award or additional information on how to find and check into the net, visit the website geratol.net.
Students at the Igor Sikorsky Kyiv Polytechnic Institute in Ukraine are looking forward to the November launch of an educational satellite they built with a group of space exploration enthusiasts. The students' CubeSat is designed to work on a variety of scientific and technical issues related to research at the Institute School, the National Technical University of Ukraine. The CubeSat, QBU-A01, will be in a sun-synchronous orbit and accessible to hams around the world who can receive telemetry, beacon, and science payload data. The nanosatellite project will focus on studies on near space and will explore the operation of solar sensors, magnometers, gyroscopes, electromagnets, and flywheels used in stabilization and orientation in space. Research will also focus on thermal regulation of a payload using heat pipes and on new software for controlling satellite systems and obtaining telemetry. Frequencies to be used are still being finalized. A 9K6 GMSK UHF downlink is proposed using AX25.
Originating from Albany, New York, and distributed worldwide, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio.
And finally this week, going all the way back to 1923, residents of the United Kingdom are required to pay a license fee to watch or record television programs as broadcast on air, and also if they stream from any online service. The license fee is currently £159, or approximately $175 for a 2-year license. With a look back at the beginnings and a look at the dreaded TV detector van and the technology used both past and present, we go across the pond where Steve Richards, G4HPE, has the story.
The United Kingdom is somewhat unique in the world for requiring those households which view broadcast television to purchase a licence for the privilege. Initially coming into being with the Wireless Telegraphy Act in 1923, the licence was required for anyone receiving broadcast radio before being expanded to cover television in 1946. The funds generated from this endeavour are used as the primary funding for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. Of course, it's all well and good to require a license, but without some manner of enforcement, the measure doesn't have any teeth. Amongst other arrangements, the BBC have gone as far as employing special detector vans to hunt down illegally operating televisions to protect its precious income. To ensure compliance, TV licensing regularly sends sternly worded letters to those who have let their license lap or have not purchased one. In the event that this fails, they may arrange a visit from enforcement officers. These officers aren't empowered to forcibly enter homes, so in the event of a homeowner declining to cooperate with the investigation, TV licensing will apply for a search warrant. This may be on the basis of evidence, such as a satellite dish or an antenna spotted on the roof of the dwelling, or a remote control spied on a couch cushion through a window. Alternatively, a search warrant may be granted on the basis of evidence gleaned from a TV detector van. Fitted with equipment to detect a TV set in use, the vans roam the streets of the United Kingdom, often dispatched to addresses with lapsed or absent TV licenses. If the van detects that a set may be operating and receiving broadcast signals, TV licensing can apply to the court for the requisite warrant to take the investigation further. The vans are almost solely used to support warrant applications. The detection van evidence is rarely, if ever, used in court to prosecute a license evader. With a warrant in hand, officers will use direct evidence, such as a television found plugged into an aerial, to bring an evader to justice through the courts. The detector vans were first deployed in 1952, with equipment designed to pick up the magnetic field from the horizontal deflection scanning of the picture tube at 10.125 kHz. Loops were used to detect the second harmonic of this signal, 20.25 kHz, which was mixed with a local beat frequency oscillator at 19.25 kHz to create a 1 kHz tone to indicate to the operator when a signal was being picked up. 3 antennas were used, one on the front of the van and 2 on the rear on the left and the right sides. When the van was next to an operating television in a house, the signal between the front and side antenna would be roughly the same. Signals from the right and left antennas could then be compared to determine which side of the street the television was on. Once independent television started broadcasting in 1963, this method of detection became impractical. The 2 television stations did not synchronize their line scan signals, so neighboring houses watching different channels would create confusing interference for the detector. To get around this, the vans switched to detecting the local oscillator of the TV set's superheterodyne VHF receiver instead. With stations broadcasting on bands spanning 47 to 240 MHz, it was impractical at the time to build a tuner and antenna to cover this entire range. Instead, the equipment was designed to work from 110 to 250 MHz, tuning in the fundamental frequencies of the higher bands or the harmonics of the lower frequency oscillators. A highly directional antenna was used to hone in on the set, and a periscope was installed to allow the operator to view the house the antenna was pointing at, and if operating in the dark, the periscope could instead be used to shine a small dot of light in the direction of the antenna. When UHF television came along, a pair of antennas was used to search for television usage, with the twin setup helping to improve directionality. The introduction of UHF transmissions led to further redesigns. Engineers again leaned on harmonics to allow a single system to cover the full range, from low VHF to higher UHF frequencies. A pair of long, log-periodic spiral antennas were used, mounted on top of the van, which could be varied in spacing to effectively tune different frequencies. In practice, the antennas would be pointed towards a row of houses while the van was slowly driven along the street. The beam pattern of the antenna pair would show 7 distinct lobes on a cathode ray tube inside the van when a TV was detected. An operator would press a button to mark house boundaries on the display as the van slowly moved along, and when the lobe pattern centered on a particular house, the TV's location was clear. The hardware was further refined over the years, with various types of antenna rig and detection equipment used as technology marched on. Well, today's efforts to detect license evasion are shrouded in mystery. Modern flat-screen displays receiving digital television signals do not emit as much radio frequency interference as older designs, and any such signals detected are less easily correlated with broadcast television. An LCD television in the home can just as easily be displaying output from a video game console or an online streaming service, with both these cases not requiring the owner to pay a license fee. Based on an alleged BBC submission for a search warrant in recent years, there may be optical methods used, in which reflected light from a television in a viewer's home is compared to the live broadcast signal. The BBC declined to answer the Freedom of Information request with any details of their methods, other than to say that they have employed vehicles and handheld devices in enforcement efforts. However, given the multitude of broadcast, cable and satellite channels now available, the comparison effort would necessarily be much harder, leading some to suspect that the days of the detective Anne are largely over. Oh, and one interesting tidbit of information for you. In the UK, 6,000 black and white television licenses were still issued in 2019. Our thanks go to Stephen, G7 Victor Foxtrot Yankee, who spotted this interesting article on the Hackaday website at hackaday.com.
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77@gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon. This Week in Amateur Radio is heard around the world on amateur radio repeater systems, streaming on the internet, or on great low-power FM broadcast stations like WGXC-FM, part of the Wavefarm, on 90.7 MHz in Akron, New York, serving Greene County and the southern regions of New York's Capital District. Many of the news and information items heard on this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, the Southgate Amateur News Service, Steve Richards, G4 Hotel Papa Echo, and the Southgate Vibes News Service, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the FCC, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia, and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the Tech Guy, Leo Laporte, the International Telecommunications Union, and various news sources on the Internet.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you'd like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and our news team around the world, this is Chris Perrine, KB2FAF, wishing you a 73.